Welcome to Lesson 3 of Old Testament Survey, Part 2. This week we're looking at the monarchy under the United Kingdom of Israel. Taking a review of our lesson outline, last week we looked at the Theocracy, where God rules. Now this week in Lesson 3 we're starting to look at the monarchy, when they have a human king over Israel. This is going to be the period when the kingdom is united. As usual, we'll start off with a question. And the question we're going to have this week is, what's the relationship between obedience to God and God's blessing? I want to take a look at this in the lives of the kings that we'll be looking at, how it relates to your life, and also how it fits into the life of those that we serve. The topics we'll be looking at during this lesson are the transition to monarchy, back from the time of the judges, how we got from the time of the judges to the time now that we have the human kings leading Israel. We'll also be looking at King Saul, King David, and King Solomon. Taking a look at our timeline, here we have the overall timeline. You can see that we've gone through the period of theocracy. Now we're into the period of monarchy, and there's just a little bit of the time where it's united. Looking at the closer up version, where we're seeing just the period of monarchy on the timeline, way over on the left there is during the time that it's united, where we have Saul, David, and Solomon. The books that we're going to be looking at here are mostly 1st and 2nd Samuel, and actually up through about chapter 11 of 1st Kings. Now the books that we call 1st and 2nd Samuel were originally one book under the Hebrew version of the text. They were divided into the two in the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew, which was done way back when. You might see this referenced with an LXX, all in capitals. That's the reference to 70 from the Roman numerals. And all the other versions that follow generally kept along with at least the versions that we are likely to see. The Eastern Orthodox does some things differently with these books. If you look at 1st Samuel, that's where we see the transition to the monarchy, and we also see this part talking about King Saul. The book of 2nd Samuel relates the life of King David. Now, the author of the books of Samuel is unknown. It's probably based on the writings of the prophets Samuel, Nathan, and Gad. Samuel's obviously written from the perspective of Samuel, but we don't know exactly who it was that wrote this down. There's several theories out there, none of which particularly hold a lot of water to give a real definite answer as to who the actual author was. And likewise, we call 1st and 2nd Kings also was originally one book. Again, it was divided into the two in the Septuagint. And 1st Kings, which we're going to be looking at partly this lesson, is seeing King Solomon, and then how we transition from the time when the kingdom is united to now it's going to be divided. And then 2nd Kings follows the divided kingdom through the fall of Israel and Judah and to the time they go into exile. Now, there actually are some of the texts that combine Samuel and Kings into 4 books they call 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Kingdoms. I personally have not seen any of those particular versions, but I believe those are some of the Eastern Orthodox and some things like that. But they might see it out there depending on who you talk to. Again, the author is unknown on the books of Kings. It's probably based on historical documents and is written by an unknown prophet during the captivity, is most likely. In fact, if you'll be looking at this as we get into probably more next week, but there'll actually be some sightings in there where they say, oh, this is, as it was written in the book of this or the book of that. So it actually does reference some other materials. So now we're going to look at this transition, how we get into the monarchy. As we left off last week, we were at the end of the book of Judges. Israel was in a state of confusion. They really didn't know what was going on. They'd been through this cycle that we looked at where they'd rebel and then they'd be conquered and then God would raise a judge and then they'd repent and then God would raise a judge and then they'd have a little time of peace and then they'd just keep repeating the cycle over and over. And things just kind of kept getting to the point where they were just really not following what God wanted. They were getting a lot more influence from the nations around them. And as it said right at the end of the book of Judges, the people were doing what was right in their own eyes. We're seeing that the priests were beginning to become a little bit corrupt in doing their job. Not all of them, obviously. But they were seeing the same effects in the priestly ranks as well as just the people of Israel. Now, when we get into this transition, we were introduced first to Eli. Now, he was both a priest and a judge, and he was actually the judge over Israel for 40 years. He followed Samson. So we were talking a little bit last week about succession, and gee, why wasn't there any plan? Well, actually we see here that after Samson, Eli handled both the chief priest and the judge duties and did that for 40 years. And then we see that Samuel is actually the last of the judges. It's also likely that he was from the priestly line, and you notice that he does do a lot of the priestly duties as he's going around doing his prophet thing. And unfortunately, we see that both the sons of Eli and the sons of Samuel did evil, and they weren't allowed to follow in their father's footsteps. Fairly early on, we see Eli's sons, they've been taking more than they should from the rightful portion that is supposed to be allotted to the priests. Samuel then confirms what God has already told Eli about the judgment that's going to come onto Eli's sons and onto Eli himself, that none of his male descendants will live very long, and they won't be allowed to be priests. And then later, we see that Samuel's sons have become corrupt, and they're taking bribes and just definitely not following in the footsteps of their father. Now, Samuel actually did come up with about 20 years of revival with the people, and they were doing some fairly good things, but they were still rebellious. Now, during this time, actually what Samuel would do is he had a circuit that he would travel. He would go from city to city on this predetermined path at different times of the year. So he would be covering a good part of Israel so he could address the needs of the people and judge them as needed and perform the various rituals that needed to be performed. You might see something somewhat similar to this in the early days of America, when they had what they called circuit riders, which were pastors that were mostly out in the western parts, the more rural areas where there weren't enough pastors to go around for all the churches. And these pastors would ride the circuit, as it was called. They'd just go from town to town, and they'd do one Sunday, they'd do their service at this church at this particular city, and then they'd do one at another one, and keep going, and then just keep repeating and following this circuit. Very much similar to what Samuel did back in his day. And if we look at 1 Samuel 8, verses 4 and 5, we can see now that this is where the people are beginning to say, hey, we're not liking what's going on. It says, then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, look, you are old, your sons do not walk in your ways. Now make us a king to judge us like all the nations. So we see here that people are looking at the other surrounding nations and they're asking for earthly king. to rule them like they see is going on with all the other nations. We see this in 1 Samuel chapter 8, verses 6 to 7. We've actually seen this one before, but we're going to look at this one again. It says, "But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, 'Give us a king to judge us.' So Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord said to Samuel, 'Heed the voice of the people and all that they have said to you. For they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them.'" Now, actually last week in the evangelism lesson, it was brought up that when you're out there and you're trying to evangelize, you're talking to people and you're spreading the gospel and you're giving your testimony and people reject you, not to take it personally, because they're actually not rejecting you, they're actually rejecting God. And that's about what God was telling Samuel here. He's saying, don't take it personally, Samuel. They're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me. So now we start looking at King Saul. So God does allow the appointment of a king. Samuel actually warns the people one more time that if they get a king, that the king's probably going to lord it over them, and is actually going to be just like the nations around him. So he's kind of pointing out that, yeah, you're looking to these other nations, but look also what's going on. And then God finally reveals his choice for the king to Samuel. That's in 1 Samuel 9:17. So when Samuel saw Saul, the Lord said to him, "There he is, the man of whom I spoke to you. This one shall reign over my people." Now, King Saul kind of looks like a king. You see the description as you're reading through there. He's tall, he's handsome, he carries himself well. Describes him as being like, a head taller than most of the people in the nation. So he's kind of got that kingly look, the tall, dark, and handsome type. Problem is, he lacks an inner strength and conviction to follow God's instructions. And if we look at it, we see that he's actually cares more about what the people and it's the fear of man more than the fear of God. He's really more worried about what's going on in the people's minds than he is in trying to actually follow what God wants. We can see this in a couple of the big examples where this brought itself to the forefront. In 1 Samuel 13:13, that's where he performs the priestly duties, doing the offering of the sacrifice, rather than waiting for Samuel to show up as he had been instructed. And that's where he gets his first chastisement from God. And then not too long after that, 1 Samuel 15, verses 17 to 19, we can see where he kept some of the spoils after defeating the Amalekites. He was told that he wasn't supposed to keep anything, but he decided it would be better. It'd be great. There's all these animals that are not blemished, and they look like they'd be great for sacrifice, so we'll just keep them, and we'll use those for sacrificing to the Lord. But that wasn't what the Lord had in mind. And so again, that had its consequences. Consequences are that God's anointing departs from Saul due to his disobedience. And that's in 1 Samuel 16:14. Now here we talk about some things we were talking about last week. We were talking about the Spirit. Talked about when Saul was first going to be appointed and he was on his way, that the Spirit came on him, and you actually see that he was then prophesying with some of these other prophets that are mentioned in the book. Now these prophets, they don't give any names or anything, but it seems like there was this group of them that would go around, and they were, I might almost call them worship leaders, because it talked about them doing their prophecies, basically praising God, worshiping him, and often accompanied by music. And Saul actually, once the Spirit came on him, joined into that and was prophesying along with them. But now that he's disobeyed God, it said the Spirit departed from him. So that's something we don't see today, is with the Spirit coming and going. Back then, the Spirit wasn't living in everybody, but it would occasionally, as they would say, come upon somebody when something needed to be done, or in the cases of the kings, it would come on them to guide them and help them. The Spirit would come upon them. But Saul does continue to rule, even though he's been officially told that he's not going to be allowed to get there, and that God is not going to be with him during the rest of his time. So it's kind of troubled times, and his leadership definitely isn't what it used to be. And at this time also, God directs Samuel to appoint another one to be king. And Saul also ruled for 40 years. Totally. So now we start looking at King David. God actually selects David, who's the son of Jesse, to be king. He has Samuel anoint him, but David doesn't become king immediately. David actually serves under Saul, even though later on Saul tries to kill him. They were introduced, obviously, back when David killed Goliath. That's when Saul decided to bring him into the court and have him perform duties there. And one of his main duties was that he played the harp that would soothe Saul after the spirit had departed him. He would have these fits of rage and etc. And playing the harp would calm him. So that was one of the things David did while there. And of course, it was during a couple of those times when Saul would then fly into a rage that he'd grab his spear and throw it at David and try to kill him. And they say even try to pin him to the wall with his spear. So that caused David to go hide from Saul. He goes out into the wilderness areas, out into the parts where Saul can't get to him as easily. He hides out there with his band of men. We also see that sometimes, at least on 2 occasions, when Saul is pursuing him, that David actually has an opportunity to kill Saul, but he refuses to do that. He actually says he will not harm God's anointed. He's going to basically leave it up to God to remove Saul from the kingship. David's not going to take it on himself to do it. Now, David has actually been called a man after God's own heart because he trusts God, he relies on God, and he mostly obeys God and follows God's commandments. You look at the Psalms that David wrote a lot of, and he's really pouring his heart out. So he really is following God, trying to use his relationship with God to allow God to guide him. He consults with God most of the time when he's trying to do something new, whether he's going to go, fight this battle or go do this or go do that. He consults God, so he's really trying to follow. And we look at this time now, so really Israel becomes united under King David here. Back during the time of Joshua and then the judges, we had seen some infighting and some disagreements between the various tribes. But now they're all pretty much united under David's rule. Also during this time, Jerusalem becomes the capital. And Israel actually gets about as strong as it's ever been during this time. And David expands the territory because under his rule, Israel conquers and subdues many of these neighboring nations that had been attacking Israel. So they managed to get rid of a lot of the problems that they were having. It's also during this time that God established what is called the Davidic covenant. This basically says that a king from the line of David will be on the throne of Israel forever, with the caveat, of course, that they have to obey. Like any promise that God gives, there's an if-then. It's like, if you do this, then I'll do that. And this was if your descendants follow my commands, do as I say, lead as I tell them to lead, then there will be one of your descendants on the throne of Israel forever. And it's going to be so much that the coming Messiah, who's the ultimate king, will actually come from David's line. If you might notice, when we get into the Christmas story, that is really emphasized how Jesus did come from the line of David, because that is the fulfillment of the promise that was made during this covenant. But of course, we all know that David wasn't perfect. He had his faults. He occasionally would get a little bit angry. He would do some things he shouldn't do. A couple of the big ones were his dealings with Nabal, where Nabal wouldn't provide the supplies that he needed for David's band of warriors that were out there protecting, and actually, in fact, protecting Nabal's shepherds as they were out in the fields, protecting him from the bandits that were out there. And also, of course, the big one, the sin with Bathsheba and the murder of Uriah. Big difference here between David and Saul was that David repented when he was confronted. In the case of Nabal, he was confronted by Abigail, who was Nabal's wife, and just saying, please don't do this. You really don't want to have his blood on your hands when you become king, because at that point in time, he was still hiding out from Saul and hadn't actually assumed the kingship yet. But Abigail came out, brought some of the supplies, and convinced him that, no, you really don't want to do this. And David, after calming down a moment, said, yeah, thank you for confronting me on this. I really shouldn't have been doing this and coming after Nabal. As we also see that God fights the fight, so Nabal died just a couple days later. And then when we look at the case with Bathsheba, Nathan the prophet confronted him with his story about the poor man who had one sheep and then the rich man took it away. And David gets all upset and say, well, that man deserves to die. And then that's when Nathan says, oh, that man is you. That had to be a real moment where it's like, oh my. But David, following his pattern, repented. He asked for God's forgiveness. But as usual, sin does have its consequences. And David's sins were no exception. One of the immediate consequences was that the son that was born out of his affair with Bathsheba dies. This also is the seeds of division within his family are being sown at this point in time, where his children are going to rebel. And we see this where a couple of them try to set themselves up as king. And then David has to suppress that. A couple of his sons are killed in the process. But through all this, David rules again for 40 years. Which brings us to King Solomon. Now, Solomon is a later son that David had with Bathsheba. Solomon is selected by God to succeed David. And this happens, but only after another son of David tries to assume the kingship. He actually sets himself up, throws a big party, and tries to make it look like he is the one that's going to be taking over the throne. Now, David's still alive at this time, but he's spending a lot of time in bed. He's having some health problems. He's getting up in age. But they come to him and say, hey, this guy's out here trying to become king, and I don't think this is what you had in mind. What are you going to do about it? So David actually does ensure that Solomon is the successor by placing him on the throne. He actually has him ride, the royal mule around the town over to where the throne is, seats him on the throne, and so that everybody can see, even his other son that was down there partying throwing his own coronation party, even though he wasn't actually supposed to be king. So David made it very public, and actually, it's possible that he was like co-ruling with Solomon for about a year before David himself actually died. Now, initially, Solomon loves God; he follows God, and we see the thing that we all think about when we think of Solomon, about how when God asked him, "What do you want?" that he requested knowledge and understanding and discernment so that he could better rule the people that were God's people. He recognized that, hey, these this is still your nation, God. These are your people, and I need the understanding, the knowledge, the wisdom, and the discernment to know what's right and what's wrong in order to rule this people the way that you want them to be ruled. He did this rather than asking for long life or personal wealth or fame. So God honored Solomon's request. He granted him the wisdom. He granted him the discernment. But he also said, because you didn't ask for these other things, and you did ask for how you could best serve my people, I'm going to give you all these other things too, the riches and the fame. So in addition to being described as the wisest man that ever lived, he was also probably the richest and the most famous as far as being known in most of the known world at that time. Now we also see that Solomon fulfills God's promise to David that David's son would build the temple for God that David had really wanted to build. David had asked, but he wasn't allowed to build the temple because God said, you've got too much blood on your hands from war and from some of this infighting that had been going on in his family. But because of all these wars that David had fought, David was a warrior. But because of all these wars, and as we said, he expanded the territory and he managed to subdue a lot of these surrounding nations. Now Solomon is able to, for the most part, reign in peace. It's a period of very calmness and peace in Israel during Solomon's reign. But now we kind of have to look at the study in contrast. Early on, Solomon, like we said, was very much following God's ways. He was trusting God. He was doing exactly what God wanted. He was wise. People were coming from all over to get benefit from his wisdom. Riches were pouring in. And we can look at this contrast now. If we look at when he was giving his prayer for the dedication of the temple after the time that they took to build the temple, it's all finished. And in 1 Kings chapter 8, we see this prayer that Solomon prayed. And it's quite a prayer. It's very good. It's, saying all the things that you would expect to be said at dedicating, the temple. And again, serve the people the way that God wants them to serve, follow God's rule, etc. So much so that in the next chapter, we see that God actually appears to Solomon once again, acknowledging that yes, he has heard the prayer and saying that yes, it will be granted. He also confirms the covenant that he had made. That, yes, if you and your descendants follow my ways, then there will be descendants of the line of David on the throne of Israel forever. And obviously, these warnings that God were giving him was because God knew what was coming up. Because we see now, as we look over into chapter 12, by now Solomon has gone into idol worship. His love for women has become more than his love for God. And he's really just kind of gone way downhill from where he used to be. And actually, one of the traditions that was back then and actually carried on until, not that terribly long ago, was that when there would be a treaty among nations, that they would often seal that with marriages. So Solomon acquired several of his many, many, many wives. through this method here, where whenever there was a treaty made, then he'd get another wife. But that, of course, brought the influence of all these other nations into him. Now, today we actually see, some of this. If we look at the royalty that is in Europe, the European royalty, a lot of those different royal families are actually related, and it's because of this tradition of, okay, we'll make this treaty, and then you'll marry them, and it would go on, and etc. So it wasn't that long ago that this was still something that was going on. But again, we see that it's the influence of these surrounding nations that's led to these idol worship. Solomon actually went and rebuilt some of the high places, as they're called, where they were worshiping some of these various idols, the Ashtoreths, the Baals, some of the the ones that were even doing, sacrifice of human sacrifice, etc. And he was doing this to satisfy, some of his wives that wanted to still worship the idols that were the gods from the areas where they came from. And again, we get back to the consequences. And the consequences of Solomon's sin and turning away from God were that the kingdom was removed from him. And in fact, the kingdom is actually divided. 10 of the tribes are actually split away. But God does leave one tribe to have a descendant of Solomon. Actually, his son is the first one to follow him, in order to keep the promise that God made to David, just because God was still so impressed with David and him being a man after God's own heart, that he's still going to keep this going as long as he can. And now we're going to see, after Solomon, ruled Israel for 40 years, we're going to see the prophets starting to take a bigger role in things, as God keeps trying to bring the people back to what they should be doing, to try to follow as they're doing, so he can keep the line of David on the throne, keep Israel to be blessed, to be a blessing, as we talked about last week, so that they can be a light to the nations around them, instead of the nations around them being the influence on Israel. You may have noticed, as we were going through this, that there was a bit of a pattern. Eli, Saul, David, and Solomon all ruled for 40 years. Eli as a judge, and of course Saul, David, and Solomon as kings. 40 years has the number 40 is kind of big in the Bible, where we see all these 40-year patterns. But now, as we get into the study next week, we're going to see that this pattern doesn't necessarily repeat once the kingdom's divided. There are some kings that have some fairly long reigns. There are some kings that will have some very, very short reigns. And just as a reminder, we should have been up through at least the middle part of 1 Kings with our reading for this lesson. For next week, finish up what's left of 1 Kings from like chapter 12 on, as we start talking about the divided kingdom. Then get into 2 Kings, the books then of Amos, Jonah, and Isaiah. And then we'll see you next week.